Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Indian Wife. Tamaroo was the daughter of a powerful chieftain of the Sioux Indians, and she was the only being ever known to turn the relentless old man from a savage purpose. Something of this influence was owing to her infantile beauty, but more to the gentleness of which that beauty was the emblem. Here was a species of loveliness rare among Indian girls. Her figure had the flexile grace so appropriate to protected and dependent women in refined countries. Her ripe, pouting lip and dimpled cheek bore the pleading air of a grieved childhood, and her dark eye had such an habitual expression of timidity and fear that the young Sioux called her the startled fawn. I know not whether her father's broad lands or her own appealing beauty was the most powerful cause of her admiration, but certain it is, Tamaroo was the unrivalled belle of the Sioux. She was a creature all formed for love. Her downcast eye, her trembling lip, and her quiet, submissive motion all spoke its language, yet various young chieftains had in vain sought her affections, and when her father urged her to strengthen his power by an alliance, she answered him only by her tears. This state of things continued until 1765, when a company of French traders came to reside there for the sake of deriving profit from the fur trade. Among them was Florimond de Rance, a young indolent Adonis whom pure ennui had led from Quebec to the Falls of St. Anthony. His fair, round face and studied foppery of dress might have done little toward gaining the heart of the gentle Sioux, but there was a deference and courtesy in his manner which the Indians never pay woman, and Tamaroo's deep sensibilities were touched by it. A more careful arrangement of her rude dress, and anxiety to speak his language fluently, and a close observance of his European customs soon betrayed the subtle power which was fast making her its slave. The ready vanity of the Frenchman quickly perceived it. At first he encouraged it with that sort of undefined pleasure which man always feels in awakening strong affection in the hearts of even the most insignificant. Then the idea that though an Indian she was a princess, and that her father's extensive lands on the Missouri were daily becoming of more consequence to his ambitious nation, led him to think of marriage with her as a desirable object. His eyes and his manner had said this long before the old chief began to suspect it, and he allowed the wily Frenchman to twine himself almost as closely around his heart as he had around the more yielding soul of his darling child. Though exceedingly indolent by nature, Florimond de Rance had acquired skill in many graceful arts which excited the wonder of the savages. He fenced well enough to foil the most expert antagonist, and in hunting his rifle was sure to carry death to the game. These accomplishments and the facility with which his pliant nation conformed to the usages of every country made him a universal favorite, and at his request he was formally adopted as one of the tribe. But, conscious as he was of his power, it was long before he dared to ask for the daughter of the haughty chief. When he did make the daring proposition, it was received with a still and terrible wrath that might well fright him from his purpose. Rage showed itself only in the swelling veins and clenched hand of the old chief. With the boasted coldness and self-possession of an Indian, he answered, "There are Sioux girls enough for the poor pale faces that come among us. A king's daughter weds the son of a king. Eagles must sleep in an eagle's nest. In vain Tamaroo knelt and supplicated. In vain she promised Florimond de Rance would adopt all his enmities and all his friendships, that in hunting and in war he would be an invaluable treasure. The chief remained inexorable. Then Tamaroo no longer joined in the dance, and the old man noticed that her rich voice was silent when he passed her wigwam. The light of her beauty began to fade, and the bright vermilion current which mantled under her brown cheek became sluggish and pale. The languid glance she cast on the morning sun and the bright earth entered into her father's soul. He could not see his beautiful child thus gradually wasting away. He had long averted his eyes whenever he saw Florimond de Rance, but one day when he crossed his hunting path he laid his hand on his shoulder and pointed to Tamaroo's dwelling. Not a word was spoken. The proud old man and the blooming lover entered it together. Tamaroo was seated in the darkest corner of the wigwam, her head leaning on her hand, her basket work tangled beside her, and a bunch of flowers the village maidens had brought her scattered and withering at her feet. The chief looked at her with a vehement expression of love, which none but stern countenances can wear. Tamaroo, he said in a subdued tone, go to the wigwam of the stranger, that your father may again see you love, to look on the rising sun and the opening flowers. There was mingled joy and modesty in the upward glance of the startled fawn of the Sioux, and when Florimond de Rance saw the light of her mild eye, suddenly and timidly veiled by its deeply fringed lid, he knew that he had lost none of his power. The marriage song was soon heard in the royal wigwam, and the young adventurer became the son of a king. Months and years passed on, and found Tamaroo the same devoted, submissive being. Her husband no longer treated her with the uniform gallantry of a lover. He was not often harsh, but he adopted something of the coldness and indifference of the nation he had joined. Tamaroo sometimes wept in secret, but so much of fear had lately mingled with her love that she carefully concealed her grief from him who had occasioned it. When she watched his countenance with that pleading, innocent look which had always characterized her beauty, she sometimes would obtain a glance such as he had given her in her former days, and then her heart would leap like a frolicsome lamb, and she would live cheerfully on the remembrance of that smile through many wearisome days of silence and neglect. Never was woman, in her heart-breaking devotedness, satisfied with such slight testimonials of love as was this gentle Sioux girl. If Florimond chose to fish, she would herself ply the oar, rather than he should suffer fatigue, and the gaudy canoe her father had given her might often be seen gliding down the stream, while Tamaroo dipped her oar in unison with her soft rich voice, and the indolent Frenchman lay sunk in luxurious repose. She had learned his religion, but for herself she never prayed. The cross he had given her was always raised in supplication for him, and if he but looked unkindly on her, she kissed it, and invoked its aid in agony of soul. She fancied the sound of his native land might be dear to him, and she studied his language with a patience and perseverance to which the savage has seldom been known to submit. She tried to imitate the dresses she had heard him describe, and if he looked with a pleased eye on any ornament she wore, it was always reserved to welcome his return. Yet for all this lavishness of love, she asked but kind approving looks which cost the giver nothing. Alas, for the perverseness of man in scorning the affection he ceases to doubt. The little pittance of love for which poor Tamaroo's heart yearned so much was seldom given. Her soul was a perpetual prey to anxiety and excitement, and the quiet certainty of domestic bliss was never her allotted portion. There were, however, two beings on whom she could pour forth her whole flood of tenderness without reproof or disappointment. She had given birth to a son and daughter of uncommon promise. Victoire, the eldest, had her father's beauty, save in the melting dark eye, with its plaintive expression and the modest drooping of its silken lash. Her cheeks had just enough of the Indian hue to give them a warm, rich coloring, and such was her early maturity that at 13 years of age her tall figure combined the graceful elasticity of youth with the majesty of womanhood. She had sprung up at her father's feet with the sudden luxuriance of a tropical flower, and her matured loveliness aroused all the dormant tenderness and energy within him. It was with mournful interest he saw her leaping along the chase with her mother's bounding sylph-like joy, and he would sigh deeply when he observed her oar rapidly cutting the waters of the Missouri, while her boat flew over the surface of the river like a wild bird in sport, and the gay young creature would wind among the eddies or dart forward with her hair streaming on the wind and her lips parted with eagerness. Tamaroo did not understand the nature of his emotions. She thought in the simplicity of her heart that silence and sadness were the natural expressions of a white man's love. But when he turned his restless gaze from his daughter to her, she met an expression which troubled her. Indifference had changed into contempt, and woman's soul, whether in the drawing-room or in the wilderness, is painfully alive to the sting of scorn. Sometimes her placid nature was disturbed by a strange jealousy of her own child. I love Victoire only because she is the daughter of Florimond, thought she, and why, oh why does he not love me for being the mother of Victoire? It was too evident that Durance wished his daughter to be estranged from her mother and her mother's people. With all members of the tribe out of his own family, he sternly forbade her having any intercourse, and even there he kept her constantly employed in taking dancing lessons from himself, and obtaining various branches of learning from an old Catholic priest, whom he had solicited to reside with him for that purpose. But this kind of life was irksome to the Indian girl, and she was perpetually escaping the vigilance of her father to try her arrow in the woods, or guide her pretty canoe over the waters. Durance had long thought it impossible to gratify his ambitious views for his daughter without removing her from the attractions of her savage home, and every day's experience convinced him more and more of the truth of this conclusion. To favor this project, he assumed an affectionate manner toward his wife, for he well knew that one look or word of kindness would at any time win back all her love. When the deep sensibilities of her warm heart were roused, he would ask for leave to sell her lands, and she, in her prodigality of tenderness, would have given him anything, even her own life, for such smiles as he then bestowed. The old chief was dead, and there was no one to check the unfeeling rapacity of the Frenchman. Tract after tract of Tamaroo's valuable land was sold, and the money remitted to Quebec, where he intended to convey his children on pretence of a visit, but in reality with the firm intent of never again beholding his deserted wife. A company of Canadian traders chanced to visit the Falls of St. Anthony just at this juncture, and Florimond Durance took the opportunity to apprise Tamaroo of his intention to educate Victoire. She entreated with all the earnestness of a mother's eloquence, but she pled in vain. Victoire and her father joined the company of traders on their return to Canada. Tamaroo knelt and fervently besought that she might accompany them. She would stay out of sight, she said. They should not be ashamed of her among the great white folks of the East, and if she could but live where she could see them every day, she should die happier. Ashamed of you, and you the daughter of a Sioux king! Exclaimed Victoire proudly, and with a natural impulse of tenderness she fell on her mother's neck and wept. Victoire, 'tis time to depart, said her father sternly. The sobbing girl tried to release herself, but she could not. Tamaroo embraced her with the energy of despair, for after all doubts and jealousies, Victoire was the darling child of her bosom. She was so much the image of Florimond when he first said he loved her. Woman, let her go, exclaimed Durance, exasperated by the length of the parting scene. Tamaroo raised her eyes anxiously to his face, and she saw that his arm was raised to strike her. I am a poor daughter of the Sioux. Oh, why did you marry me?" she exclaimed in a tone of passionate grief. "For your father's land," said the Frenchman coldly. This was the drop too much. Poor Tamaroo, with a piercing shriek, fell to the earth and hid her face in the grass. She knew not how long she remained there. Her highly wrought feelings had brought on a dizziness of the brain, and she was conscious only of a sensation of sickness, accompanied by the sound of receding voices. When she recovered, she found herself alone with Louis, her little boy, then about 6 years old. The child had wandered there after the traders had departed, and having in vain tried to waken his mother, he laid himself down by her side and slept on his bow and arrows. From that hour Tamaroo was changed. Her quiet, submissive air gave place to a stern and lofty manner, and she, who had always been so gentle, became as bitter and implacable as the most bloodthirsty of her tribe. In little Louis all the strong feelings of her soul were centred, but even her affection for him was characterized by a strange, unwonted fierceness. Her only care seemed to be to make him like his grandfather, and to instill a deadly hatred of white men. The boy learned his lessons well. He was the veriest little savage that ever let fly an arrow. To his mother alone he yielded anything like submission, and the Sioux were proud to hail the haughty child as their future chieftain. Such was the aspect of things on the shores of the Missouri when Florimond de Rance came among them after an absence of 3 years. He was induced to make this visit, partly from a lingering curiosity to see his boy, and partly from the hope of obtaining more land from the yielding Tamaroo. He affected much contrition for his past conduct, and promised to return with Victoire before the year expired. Tamaroo met him with the most chilling indifference, and listened to him with a vacant look, as if she heard him not. It was only when he spoke of her boy that he could arouse her from this apparent lethargy. On this subject she was all suspicion. She had a sort of undefined dread that he, too, would be carried away from her, and she watched over him like a she-wolf when her young is in danger. Her fears were not unfounded, for de Rance did intend, by demonstrations of kindness and glowing descriptions of Quebec, to kindle in the mind of his son a desire to accompany him. Tamaroo thought the hatred of white men, which she had so carefully instilled, would prove a sufficient shield, but many weeks had not elapsed before she saw that Louis was fast yielding himself up to the fascinating power which had entrammelled her own youthful spirit. With this discovery came horrible thoughts of vengeance, and more than once she had nearly nerved her soul to murder the father of her son. But she could not. Something in his features still reminded her of the devoted young Frenchman who had carried her quiver through the woods and kissed the moccasin he had stooped to lace, and she could not kill him. The last cutting blow was soon given to the heart of the Indian wife. Young Louis, full of boyish curiosity, expressed a wish to go with his father, though he at the same time promised a speedy return. He always had been a stubborn boy, and she felt now as if her worn-out spirit would vainly contend against his wilfulness. With that sort of resigned stupor which often indicates approaching insanity, she yielded to his request, exacting, however, a promise that he would sail a few miles down the Mississippi with her the day before his departure. The day arrived. Tamaroo decked herself in the garments and jewels she had worn on the day of her marriage, and selected the gaudiest wampum belts for Louis. "Why do you put these on?" said the boy. "Because Tamaroo will no more see her son in the land of the Sioux," said she mournfully, "and when her father meets her in the spirit land, he will know the beads he gave her." She took the wondering boy by the hand and led him to the waterside. There lay the canoe her father had given her when she left him for the wigwam of the stranger. It was faded and bruised now, and so were all her hopes. She looked back on the hut where she had spent her brief term of wedded happiness, and its peacefulness seemed a mockery of her misery. And was she, the lone, the wretched, the desperate and deserted one, was she the startled fawn of the Sioux for whom contending chiefs had asked in vain? The remembrance of all her love and all her wrongs came up before her memory, and death seemed more pleasant to her than the gay dance she had once loved so well. But then her eye rested on her boy, And, oh God, with what an agony of love! It was the last vehement struggle of a soul, all formed for tenderness. "We will go to the spirit land together," she exclaimed. "He cannot come there to rob me." She took Louis in her arms as if he had been a feather, and springing into the boat, she guided it toward the falls of St. Anthony. "Mother, mother, the canoe is going over the rapids," screamed the frightened child. "My father stands on the waves and beckons," she said. The boy looked on the horribly fixed expression of her face and shrieked aloud for help. The boat went over the cataract. End of Section 5.